The rain came down over Chicago like the sky was trying to wash the city clean of something, and it wasn't working. Isabella Moretti stood in the middle of a warehouse she'd never seen and counted the men around her. 9. She counted them the way she counted everything fast, silent, filing each number into the part of her mind that never stopped. 9 men, 3 exits, 1 chained, 2 cameras, both real, and her father, standing off to the side, refusing to meet her eyes. "You're sure about the arrangement?" said a voice from the shadows near the far wall. "I'm sure," her father said. His voice cracked on the second word. "She settles the debt, all of it." Her heart was going so fast she thought they could hear it, but she'd learned, over 26 years of being the girl no one looked at twice, how to keep her face still. She kept it still now. She'd come home that evening expecting another quiet dinner, another night of her father and brothers talking around her like the chair she sat in was empty. Instead, there'd been a black car at the curb and 2 men who said her name like it was a receipt. "Isabella Moretti, you're the payment." 3 debts, 3 men. Her father had spread himself across the underworld the way a drowning man grabs at anything that floats, and he'd signed her name at the bottom of every note. Rocco Bianchi, who ran the docks and had a voice like gravel in a cement mixer. Genevieve Lang, cold and elegant, who laundered money through a chain of casinos the way other people breathed. And the third, the one in the shadows. "Bring her forward," he said. Isabella walked. She didn't wait to be pushed. She decided, somewhere between the car and the warehouse, that whatever happened, she would not let them see her flinch. It was the only thing she owned that they couldn't take. The man stepped into the light, and later she'd failed to describe him. Tall, dark-haired, dressed in black that cost more than her father's whole life, but it wasn't that. It was the stillness. Every other man in that warehouse was performing danger, crossed arms, hard jaws, guns held just visibly enough. Damien Cross wasn't performing anything. He simply was the danger, the way winter is cold. "You understand what's happening here," he said. "Not a question. I understand my father sold me to 3 people to cover 3 debts he can't pay." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "I understand none of this is legally enforceable, which means you're all counting on the fact that I have nowhere to run." She let her gaze move across the room, the dock boss, the casino queen, the man in black. "And I understand the 3 of you have never been in a room together before tonight, which means someone arranged this. So my real question is which one of you is smart enough to have done it or whether none of you did, and you're all being played." The warehouse went very quiet. Rocco Bianchi laughed first, a short, surprised bark. Genevieve Lang tilted her head with the slow interest of a cat noticing something move. And Damien Cross did not laugh, did not move, but something flickered behind his eyes, so fast she almost missed it. Almost. She never missed anything. It wasn't surprise. It was recognition. He'd been waiting for her to say exactly that. "Take her to the car," Damien said quietly. "She's mine." The math fell apart the moment anyone with sense looked at it, and Isabella had sense to spare. She sat in the back of the black car as it slid through the rain and did what she always did, not out of hope, but because numbers were the only language that had ever told her the truth. 400,000 to Bianchi, 300 to Lang, to the Cross Syndicate, a number no one said out loud, which meant it was the largest. Over $1 million, accrued in 18 months, by a man who'd never in his life held on to 100. Someone had given her father that money, walked him to a hole and handed him the shovel. And Isabella knew it, because for 6 years she was the one who'd kept the family business breathing. Not her father's handshakes, not his name, her. The nights she stayed up rerouting shipments and rewriting manifests. The suppliers who thought they were emailing a man. The custom seams she'd learned to slip a payment through so it left as one thing and arrived as another, clean. She knew what a laundered dollar looked like because she'd spent 6 years quietly laundering the difference between what her family earned and what they owed, just to keep the lights on. She knew what a shell company smelled like because she'd built 3 of them herself, defensive little fictions to keep predatory vendors from seeing how thin the Morettis really were. Her father thought the business ran on him. It ran on her crimes, small and careful and invisible. And no one had ever noticed, because a man who believes his daughter is useless doesn't check whether the useless daughter is the reason he still eats. So when someone flooded him with easy money, he took it and never asked why, and never told her, because she was furniture. And now the furniture understood something the three most dangerous people in Chicago had missed. The debts weren't real. They were bait. She just didn't yet know for what. The car dropped down into a garage beneath a building that scraped the low clouds. Damien Cross opened her door himself, which surprised her. "You're not going to hurt me," she said. "Not bravery. Observation. No, because you need something from me." He looked at her fully for the first time since the warehouse. "Everyone in that room wanted to own you," he said. "You saw that within a minute. You also saw that none of them knew why. Do you know why, Isabella?" Her name in his mouth did something to her spine she refused to examine. "No," she admitted. "Neither do they," he said. "That's what makes it dangerous." He gave her a room. That was the first thing she didn't expect. Not a cell, a room with a bed larger than her family's kitchen, black marble, a window that ran floor to ceiling. On the bed, clothes in her size. Her actual size, chosen by someone who hadn't guessed and hadn't lied, to make her feel worse the way clothing had done her whole life. Everything fit. Everything was beautiful. And something about that was worse than a cell. She didn't sleep. She worked the problem because it was the only thing keeping her upright. Who benefits? Always the first question, not who did it, who benefits. If this were about money, the debts would have been called in as money. If it were about her father, he'd be dead. If it were about the business, someone would have taken the business, which was worth almost nothing on paper, because she'd spent 6 years keeping it deliberately, defensively small, which left one answer that fit all the numbers. It was about her. Someone had spent over $1 million to put Isabella Moretti in that warehouse, someone who couldn't simply take her, because to take her openly was to admit she was worth taking. And that would raise the exact question her family had spent her whole life refusing to ask. Why is she worth anything at all? At dawn, Damien knocked. He knocked. She'd remember that. "You didn't sleep," he said. "Neither did you." The corner of his mouth moved not a smile, the place a smile comes from. He led her to a study lined with screens. On the largest, a web of names and photographs and dollar amounts connected by lines, and her breath stopped, because it was her father's debts, all three, traced back through a maze of shell companies to one name. "Victor Sloan," she read. "You know him?" No, she studied it. And the more she studied, the colder she got, because it was elegant. This thing, elegant the way her own best work was elegant. And she recognized the mind behind it the way you recognize handwriting. But I know how he thinks. He didn't loan my father money. He built a machine that could only end one way. He ceded all three debts. He wanted me handed to whichever of you claimed me. And then she stopped. Then what? She turned. For the first time, the fear in her chest wasn't for herself. Then he'd take me from whoever won. A woman claimed as payment doesn't exist, Damien. No name, no record, no one looking. My own family sold me. If I vanish tomorrow, who reports it? He engineered a version of me the world already agreed to forget. He didn't buy a debt. He manufactured a ghost. The silence after that was different from all the silences before. Damien looked at her the way she imagined he'd never looked at anyone, not desire, though that was somewhere in it, and not fear, because she doubted he felt fear. He looked at her like a man looking at a mirror that had, impossibly, looked back. "I bought all three debts an hour ago," he said. "Bianchi and Lang took the money gladly. They never wanted a person. You belong to no one now but the paper in my safe, which means I can put you on a plane this morning, and you can spend your life running from a man who's never once failed to find what he's looking for. Or you stay, and we take Victor Sloan apart, and you're the one who ends him. I've been trying to reach him for a year. I've never gotten close. You looked at his work for 90 seconds and saw the shape of his whole mind. Why do you want him?" she asked. Something closed in his face. "That's not part of the offer." "Then the offer's incomplete," she said, "and I don't sign incomplete contracts." Damien Cross let out a slow breath that was almost a laugh. "God help me. Stay, and I'll tell you everything. But not yet. Not until you trust me enough to believe it." "I don't trust you at all." "I know," he said. "That's why I know you're the only one who can help me." She stayed. She told herself it was strategy. It was partly strategy. And the work was where she came alive. She didn't hack anything. That was the first thing she made Damien understand. On the second day, when his people brought her a laptop and a list of Sloane's known servers like they expected her to break a firewall. "I'm not going to get in that way," she said. "His technical security is better than anything I could beat, and better than anything you could beat, or you'd have done it already. That's the wrong door." "Then what's the right one?" "Paper," she said. "Money always touches paper eventually. A man who launders through this many shells has to make them look like real companies. Real companies file real things, customs forms, shipping manifests, import declarations. That's not his world. That's mine." She started with the shipping records. Because shipping records were the one place in the world Isabella Moretti was smarter than anyone alive. For 6 years she'd falsified her own, and a person who's falsified a thing knows exactly what a falsified version of that thing looks like from the inside. It took her 4 days to find the crack, and when she found it, she almost laughed out loud. One of Sloane's shells, a nothing company called Meridian Freight, on paper an importer of industrial ceramics, had filed a customs declaration 18 months back for a shipment out of Rotterdam. The paperwork was flawless. Beautiful, actually. Except for one thing. The declared weight of the cargo and the declared container class didn't match. 40,000 pounds of industrial ceramics in a container rated, by its own listed serial prefix, for refrigerated goods. No customs officer would ever catch it. No banker, no lawyer, no rival boss. You'd have to have spent years personally arranging shipments, personally choosing container classes to shave costs, personally staring at those serial prefixes at 2 in the morning, to know that a reefer container costs 40% more than a dry box, and no sane importer of ceramics would ever pay for one. Which meant Meridian Freight had never shipped ceramics. It had shipped something that needed to stay cold and then papered over it with a product that didn't. And whoever built that fiction had made exactly the mistake a brilliant man makes when he's brilliant at everything except the one grubby trade Isabella had bled over for 6 years. "He's never actually run cargo," she said to Damien that night, tapping the screen. "He buys the paperwork from someone who has, or he generates it from a template. Look, this container class. He doesn't know what it means. It's the kind of mistake you only make if you've never had to pay the bill." She sat back. "I can't get into his servers, but I don't need his servers. He built 40 shell companies, and every one of them had to touch the same handful of freight forwarders and customs brokers to look real. I don't have to break his wall. I just have to follow the ceramics." Damien stood very still in the light of the screens. "How long have you been able to do this?" "Since I was 20, she said. "It's how I kept my father out of prison without him ever knowing he was almost in it." He didn't say anything for a long moment. When he did, his voice was lower than before. "Your family had a person like you in the house for 6 years and used you to answer the phone. They didn't know what I was." "No," Damien said, and something in the way he said it made her look up. "They didn't." The tension between them built the way pressure builds before a storm in the space between words. In the moment, his hand almost touched the small of her back to guide her through a doorway, and then didn't. Once, reaching for the same file, their fingers met, and both of them went still, and for 3 full seconds neither breathed, and then he pulled his hand back like the paper had burned him and said, in a voice slightly rougher than usual, "You should rest," and left the room. She did not rest. She sat with her heart pounding and hated how much she'd wanted him not to pull away. But on the 9th day, the wanting curdled into something colder, and it was her own mind that did it to her. She'd found the deepest layer, a chain of transfers that finally, unmistakably, tied Meridian Freight and 11 other shells back to a single holding entity. She'd solved it. She was reaching for the phone to tell Damien when she noticed the metadata on the file she'd been working inside all week. It had been created before she arrived, before the warehouse, 4 months before. The map of Sloane's machine that Damien had shown her that first morning, the one she'd assumed he'd built from his own dead-ended year of trying, had been assembled with information he shouldn't have had unless he'd been watching her family. There were notes in the margins of the underlying files, observations, subject reroutes, shipments personally, late nights, subject negotiates under male alias, subject unprotected. Subject. Isabella sat back very slowly. She knew that word. She'd been that word her whole life. Furniture, collateral, payment. And now, apparently, Subject a thing to be studied and mapped, and when the moment came, deployed. Damien hadn't stumbled onto her in a warehouse. He'd known who she was before she'd ever walked in. He'd been watching her for months, and he'd let her believe it was chance, and then he'd handed her a problem perfectly shaped to make her brilliant mind do the one thing his year of effort couldn't. The room seemed very cold. She thought about her father, who had used her for 6 years and called it family. She thought about her brothers, taking credit at dinner. She thought about how the first man who'd ever seemed to see her had seen her, apparently, the exact same way as an instrument, a better-dressed version of the same theft. She was still sitting there when Damien came in and saw her face. "What happened?" he said, immediately, crossing the room. "When did you first find me?" Isabella said quietly. "The truth, the date." He stopped. She watched him decide whether to lie, and she watched him choose not to, and even furious she noted it. 4 months ago, he said. "You watched me." "Yes. You built this map before the warehouse. You knew exactly what I could do before you ever offered me a room. You handed me a puzzle you already knew I'd solve because you'd spent months learning that solving puzzles is what I am." Her voice didn't rise. It got quieter, which was worse. My whole life, everyone who was supposed to protect me was really just using the one thing I'm good for and calling it something else. My father called it family. You call it an offer, but it's the same thing, isn't it, Damien? You found a woman with a useful brain and you engineered a situation where she had no choice but to point it wherever you needed. No, he said it hard, but he didn't come closer, and she understood that he understood that if he touched her right now it would prove her right. "Isabella, no, that's not." "Then tell me why," she said. "You said you'd tell me everything once I trusted you enough to believe it. I don't trust you at all right now, so take your worst shot. Tell me now." And Damien Cross, feared across 2 coasts, stood in the middle of his own study and told her the truth as if it cost him blood. "A year ago, I intercepted one of Sloane's communications," he said. He'd named a target he intended to acquire his word through a manufactured debt. No name, just a description. A woman running a small import business under a false identity. Brilliant. Invisible. Unprotected. He looked at her, and there was a rawness in his face a man like him should not have been able to show. I spent a year trying to find her before he did, not to use her, to warn her, because I knew what Sloane does with the people he acquires, and I could not stand the thought of him getting his hands on someone whose only crime was being too smart in a place no one was looking. "That's a very clean story," Isabella said. "Warn me. You could have knocked on my door in a suit and warned me any day for 4 months. "I know." "Then why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, it was the most unguarded she'd ever hear him. "Because 4 months ago I found you," he said, "and I watched you win an argument with a supplier who thought he was talking to a man and win it so gracefully he never knew he'd lost. I watched you buy your mother flowers with money you couldn't spare and let your brothers take the credit for your work and never once complain. And I realized that if I knocked on your door as a stranger and told you the truth, you would look at me the way you're looking at me right now, like one more person who wanted something from that mind of yours. And I couldn't." He stopped, started again, rougher. "I told myself I was waiting for the right moment because it was safer. That was a lie. I was waiting because I didn't want to be one more man who approached you as a use. And then your father put you in that warehouse before I ever found my moment. And I bought those debts not to stop Sloane, but because I could not stand in that room and watch someone sell you and do nothing." The rain had started again against the glass. Isabella's hands were not quite steady. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes, the map, the word subject. You let me find it instead of showing me." "Because I'm a coward about exactly one thing," Damien said. "I have never in my life been afraid of losing anything until I met a woman who was already convinced that everyone leaves. And I knew that the moment I told you I'd been watching you, you'd hear it as ownership, because that's the only version of being wanted you've ever been handed." He finally closed the distance, but he didn't touch her. He stopped close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and he said, low, "I don't want your mind, Isabella. I mean, I do. God, I do. Watching you work is the best thing I've felt in a decade, but I don't want it the way they wanted it. I want the woman who buys flowers she can't afford. I would burn Sloane's whole empire and mine with it and never touch your brilliant, terrifying brain again if that's what it took for you to believe you're worth more than what you can do for someone. Isabella looked at this dangerous man who had just handed her the one thing no one had ever handed her, a choice, with no obligation attached, and felt the cold thing in her chest crack straight down the middle. "Don't make me matter to you," she said, and her voice shook. "Everyone who was supposed to protect me traded me for something. I can survive being a ghost. I don't know if I can survive being wanted and then thrown away again. Then let me be the first thing in your life that doesn't leave," he said. He didn't kiss her. That was what undid her, that he didn't, that he stood there and let her decide. This man who took whatever he wanted from the whole world, waiting on the choice of a girl her own family had priced at $1 million and change. She was the one who closed the distance. Victor Sloan made his move 6 days later, and he made it the way she'd known he would, quietly, elegantly, aimed at the one weakness he thought she still had, her family. The call came at 2 a.m. Her father, his voice different than she'd ever heard it. Afraid. There were men in the apartment, he said. Men who said Isabella had to come to a meeting, alone, or her mother and brothers would settle her debts instead. Isabella, her father said, and for the first time in 26 years he said her name like it belonged to a person. "I'm sorry. God, I'm so sorry. I never knew what you—" "I know you didn't," she said, and to her own surprise she meant it. "That was always the problem, Dad." She hung up. Damien was already awake, watching her. "It's a trap, obviously. He wants you alone and off my ground." "Yes. So we don't go." "We go," Isabella said, "but not the way he thinks, and we assume he's smarter than his message. A man who spent 6 years and $1 million doesn't build one plan, he builds 3. When I take away his blackmail, he'll have a second move ready, so we're going to have a third." Because here was the thing Sloan had never understood, for all his elegance. He'd built his empire on the belief that Isabella Moretti was a ghost, invisible, unprotected, forgettable. It was the assumption under every move he'd made, the same assumption her father had made, and her brothers, and every person who'd ever looked past her, and it was wrong. She spent the next 18 hours doing what she did best. She didn't gather men or guns. She gathered information, the thing Sloan sold, the thing he lived on, the thing he'd never imagined anyone could take from him. Because a man who builds his power on knowing everyone's secrets has one fatal flaw. All those secrets have to be kept somewhere, and she'd followed the ceramics all the way home. She knew where the spider kept his web now, a data vault, yes, unbreakable, but the vault had to be paid for, quietly, through the same shell architecture she'd already cracked open. She couldn't get inside it, but she could see every wire that fed it. And a thing you can't break, you can sometimes starve. But that was only the first move. Sitting across from Damien at 4 a.m., she laid out the second and the third, and even he who feared nothing went quiet. "If you're wrong about his backup plan," he said, "you'll be alone in that room when it happens." "I'm not going to be wrong," she said. "I've been him. I know what a man builds when he's certain he's the smartest one in the room. He builds a trapdoor. And a man who's certain he's the smartest one in the room never checks whether someone's found the trapdoor first." The meeting was at a shuttered casino Genevieve Lang had loaned to Sloan without knowing whose side she was really on, because Isabella had made sure Genevieve got a very interesting phone call about exactly what Victor Sloan's files said about her. That was the first domino. There would be several. Isabella walked in alone, spine straight, and sat across a long black table from Victor Sloan. He wasn't what she expected. She'd pictured someone like Damien dark, imposing. Sloan was mild, balding, pleasant, the kind of man you'd trust with your taxes. He smiled at her with something that looked almost like warmth. "Isabella Moretti," he said, "do you know, you're the only person in 6 years who ever saw me coming. I think we may be the 2 smartest people in this city. It seems a waste for us to be enemies." "We're not enemies," she said calmly. "Enemies are equals. You spent 6 years and $1 million trying to acquire a woman you were too much of a coward to simply approach. You couldn't imagine wanting something and just asking. You had to own it, cage it, make sure it could never say no." She folded her hands on the table, "which is why you're going to lose." His smile didn't waver. "You're alone, Isabella. Cross isn't coming. My men closed the roads, and I confess I'm a little disappointed. I expected you'd try to release my files, turn my own leverage against me, rally the families to my door. He spread his hands, almost gentle. I moved everything 2 hours ago. The vault you've been so carefully starving? Empty since midnight. Whatever you release tonight is a shadow. You brought a knife to cut a rope I already cut myself. And there it was, Plan B, right on schedule. Isabella did not flinch. She had, in fact, been counting on it because a man that careful would never leave his web where his enemy could burn it. The blackmail play had never been the real move. It had been the bait, the obvious gambit she needed him to feel clever about beating, so that he'd tip his hand and show her where the files had gone. You moved everything, she said slowly, as if just realizing it, 2 hours ago, to a clean site, off the Shell network, somewhere I could never trace. She let him have 3 full seconds of triumph. Then, how did you pay for it, Victor? The smallest change in his face. You've never run a single dollar through your own hands in your life, Isabella said. You buy your infrastructure through cutouts because your name can never touch anything. Which means moving a vault that size, in a hurry, at midnight, meant wiring someone. And the only accounts fast enough to move that kind of money on 2 hours' notice were the freight forwarder settlement accounts, Meridian's brokers, the ceramics people. She tilted her head. I've owned those accounts since Tuesday. Not the vault, the plumbing. Everything you moved tonight, you routed straight through pipes I've been sitting inside for 4 days, watching. You didn't escape my trap, Victor. You mistook it for the exit. The pleasant mask did not so much crack as simply fall off, all at once. And underneath it was the thing she'd known was there the whole time. A small, frightened man who'd spent his life making sure no one could ever leave him or refuse him or overlook him. Because somewhere, long ago, someone had done all 3. That's not. He was already reaching for his phone. You couldn't. In 4 days, you couldn't possibly. I did it in 4 days, Isabella said, because I spent 6 years doing exactly this to keep my father out of prison, and he never noticed either. She stood. You made the same mistake he did, Victor. You looked at me and saw the thing you could use. Neither of you ever once considered that the thing you were using might be the most dangerous person in the room. The doors at the far end of the casino opened. Damien Cross walked in, and he was not alone. Behind him came men she recognized Bianchi's, Lang's, and others she didn't. Not because Damien had brought an army. Because every single person Victor Sloan had ever blackmailed now knew, thanks to the shadow files Isabella had released, the ones she'd let him think were his only worry exactly how much he'd been holding over them, and every one of them had arrived with the same shared and urgent desire. He'd made himself indispensable to everyone. Isabella had simply made him inconvenient to all of them at once, and then, when he moved his real web to escape it, she'd been holding the pipes it flowed through. 2 traps. He'd sprung the first and walked, congratulating himself, straight into the second. Sloan stood, phone dead in his hand, looking at the room full of men he'd spent a decade making dependent on him and who now, to a person, wanted only to make sure he never spoke again. You could have had everything, he said hoarsely, and it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to Isabella or to the room. With me. I saw you. No, Isabella said. You watched me. That's not the same thing. If you'd actually seen me, you'd have known I was never going to be anyone's collateral. Not my father's. Not yours. She looked across the room at Damien, and something steady passed between them. And not his either. I'm not owned. I chose. She walked the length of that long black table, past the man who'd spent 6 years and a fortune trying to cage her, and she did not look back. She'd already stopped thinking about him. That, in the end, was the cruelest thing she could do to a man like Victor Sloan. She made him, at last, invisible. What happened after she left the room, Isabella never asked, and Damien never told her, and some silences are their own kind of mercy for the one who chooses not to break them. They took the empires apart and built something else from the pieces. Not overnight, these things don't happen overnight. But in the months after, the story of the casino traveled through the city's underworld and changed shape as it went, until the name Isabella Moretti stopped being spoken with pity and started being spoken with something closer to respect. The woman who'd walked into a room owned by 3 bosses and walked out owning all 3 of their debts. The ghost who refused to disappear. Bianchi, who valued nothing but competence, sent her a bottle of wine older than she was, and a note that said only terms accepted. Genevieve Lang, who'd nearly been ruined by Sloane's files and knew exactly who'd warned her in time, became something rarer than a friend, an ally. And the syndicate Damien had built on fear began, quietly, under Isabella's hand, to run on something more durable. Information given freely instead of hoarded. Debts structured to be paid instead of to trap. The mind that had kept a dying import business alive for 6 years turned loose on an empire, and the empire had never been stronger. Her father came to see her once, months later. He stood small and grey in the lobby of a building she now half-owned, unable to meet her eyes. "I didn't know," he said. "All those years. I thought everyone thought." "I know what everyone thought," Isabella said. "Not cruel, just true. Your mother always said we didn't deserve you," he said, and his voice broke. "I told her not to be dramatic. I sold my own daughter to pay for my mistake, and you came out of it queen of the whole city." She looked at this man who'd priced her at $1 million and change, who'd refused for 26 years to see the one thing that would have saved him if he'd only looked, and found she wasn't angry anymore. Anger was a debt too, and she was done carrying debts that weren't hers. "You didn't sell me, Dad," she said gently. "You threw away something valuable because you never bothered to find out what it was. That's a different thing, and it's the most expensive mistake you'll ever make." She squeezed his hand once and let it go. "Tell Mum I'll call her Sunday." She watched him leave. She did not cry. She'd done all her crying years ago, alone, in the dark, over ledgers no one knew she kept. Damien found her that night on the terrace, watching the city she'd somehow come to hold in her hand. The rain had stopped. The sky over Chicago was clear for once, and the lights below burned like something that belonged to her. He came to stand beside her, close but not touching, the way that still, after everything, made her breath go shallow. "You could leave now," he said. "Nothing holds you here anymore. Sloane's gone. Your name is free. You could go anywhere and be anyone." "I know. So why are you still here?" She turned to look at him, this dangerous man, who'd bought her freedom and never once tried to own the rest, who'd been terrified of exactly one thing in the whole world, and it had been her thinking she was only worth her mind. "Because for 26 years, Isabella said, everyone who was supposed to keep me chose something else over me, and you're the first one who chose me over the thing I'm useful for. You told me you'd give up the smartest weapon you've ever had if it meant I'd believe I was worth more than what I could do for you." She reached out and took his hand, his actual hand, warm and scarred and steady. "No one ever offered me the useless version of myself before. You're the only person who ever wanted the girl who buys flowers she can't afford, not the one who moves the money." He looked at her the way he had in the study that first morning, seeing a mind that matched his own, except now there was no fear left in it at all. "Say it again," he said quietly. "I choose you," Isabella said. "I choose this, not because I'm owned, not because I've nowhere else to go. I'm the woman who walked into a room owned by 3 empires and walked out owning them, and I'm choosing, of my own free will, to stand right here." And Damien Cross, feared across 2 coasts, master of a city that had once tried to sell her, lifted her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles like a vow. When he finally kissed her mouth, it was not the kiss of a man who'd bought something. It was the kiss of a man who'd been, from the very first moment in that rain-soaked warehouse, completely and utterly conquered. Below them, the city glittered, and somewhere in it, 3 empires now answered, one way or another. To a full-figured girl, her family had thrown away the one who'd done the one thing no one ever expected the burden, the ghost, the payment, to do. She had refused to be sold. She had chosen, instead, to reign. The rain always comes back to Chicago, but this time it fell on a woman who was no longer waiting in it for someone to notice her worth. She had spent a lifetime being counted, priced, traded, and in the end, the only number that mattered was the one she chose for herself. If Isabella's story stayed with you, if you felt that quiet moment when someone is finally wanted for who they are, not what they can do, leave a like so it reaches the next person who needs to hear it. Subscribe to keep stories like this alive, and share it with someone who's ever felt overlooked in a room full of people. And tell me this, if you were Isabella, standing free with the whole world open to you, would you have stayed or walked away and never looked back?